Thank you very much. Welcome, and thank you all for coming this afternoon to our celebratory event. I'm Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs here at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. The official title is the DC Teaching Site. If we say it's a campus, then we get taxed by the city of Washington, so don't ever say the word campus about this teaching site. Anyway, thank you for coming this evening. I would like to acknowledge our dean here, John Sherman, who just started actually last summer as our dean, but he comes from DC and had very senior positions at the Pentagon and the CIA before he joined us. We have a number of distinguished guests. I'm not going to include everybody because if I do, we have general officers, we have retired ambassadors, some of whom I've known for many years. If I start introducing everybody, I will forget someone and then I'll get into a lot of trouble. But welcome all. I want to welcome also the daughter of General Scowcroft and his granddaughter, who will be speaking in just a minute. Tonight we will look at General Scowcroft's enduring legacy in national security and foreign policy, particularly at a difficult time in American foreign policy, domestically and internationally. But before we begin, I'd like to have Karen Scowcroft, Brent's daughter, just make a few welcoming remarks. Karen, please.
Thank you. Don't worry, I'll be brief. Thank you so much, Andrew. My daughter Megan and I are delighted to be here to recognize what would have been my dad's 100th birthday. I want to thank the Scowcroft Institute for pursuing critical research on issues of importance in international affairs and for mentoring young scholars and practitioners. This was a cause that was near and dear to my father. Mentorship is even more important these days than ever before. When I think of my dad, the three words that first come to mind are honesty, integrity, and humility, qualities that are sadly not in abundance today. These were also the qualities of President Bush, my father's dear friend, former boss, and namesake for the school that so appropriately houses this institute. I suspect both my father and President Bush would be appalled by so many recent events, both international and domestic. It's critically important that the organizations such as the Scowcroft Institute continue to provide a place where the values and accomplishments of people like my father and President Bush can be lauded, studied, and researched. A place where great thoughts and great people will survive until we can emerge from this dark period that we currently find ourselves. I look forward to hearing reflections from both my father's longtime friends and from scholars on the impact of his life and leadership on national security and foreign policy, and hopefully also a guide for a brighter future. Thank you all for being here.
So this is the only story I'm going to tell. It's a quick story. When I started as director of the Scowcroft Institute in 2013, I went to see Brent and I said, we're going to start a pandemic program. And the first thing I was worried about is he would not know what a pandemic is because we hadn't had one since 1918, excuse me, 1918. And that was really serious. And I was a little nervous as to how he's going to react. And he looked at me and he said, number one, you never have to come to me to ask to start anything. Just do what you need to do. And he said, I think it's a brilliant idea because no one else is studying it. And there is going to be a pandemic at some point. I said, that's why we started the program. We did not know it would be called COVID. We didn't know when it would start or the consequences. But we've been running it since 2014. This is our 11th year. We had a summit. We call them summits each year. It was held yesterday on H5N1, which you may not realize has profoundly affected the dairy industry and the poultry industry in the United States. But it's spread around the world. There are repercussions to food security in the developing world as well. Anyway, so thank you for your comments, Karen. I also want to give special thanks to Ginny Mulberger, who could not be here today, who has been one of the other people, along with Karen and Megan, who've been cultivating General Scowcroft's legacy. Tonight we will hear short lectures from distinguished guests, Dr. Richard Haas, Professor Bartholomew Sparrow, Dr. Jane Hall-Lute, and Dr. James Wilson. I will provide a short introduction for each speaker prior to their presentation. Then we will have a Q&A at the end, but in between we will have a short reception for desserts, and you can eat while you're asking questions. We're honored to first welcome Dr. Richard Haas, one of our most distinguished diplomats and the former president for 2 decades of the Council on Foreign Relations, with a career that spans key roles in government, diplomacy, and policy. He has earned global recognition for his contributions to international relations. 10 books, 12 books? Something like that. And peace building. We look forward to hearing your insights, Richard, please. Just for it.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me just start off by saying I find it difficult to believe that today marks the 100 years. Where's Karen? If I'm right, to the day since your dad's and your grandfather, Megan, was born, and close to 5 years since we gathered to eulogize him. I won't repeat what I said that day at Arlington, but instead what I want to do is focus on Brent's approach to foreign policy and more broadly, his approach to national security. First, though, some disclosure here. It's warranted. Brent and I worked together for all 4 years of 41's presidency, George H.W. Bush, 1989 to 93. We didn't know each other that well beforehand, but we became close, and then we stayed close over the next 2 decades. So I'm going to do my best here in the next few minutes to be objective and to compartmentalize, but I won't guarantee I will fully succeed. I'll say one other thing, because when Karen mentioned it, Brent was a great mentor, both by what he said, but also by simply how he did it. And for me, I learned as much or more from him than any other boss I've ever had. So it's important to place people in history. I used to co-teach a course at Harvard about the lessons of history, and I taught it with Dick Neustadt and Ernie May every now and then. And so let's place Brent in history. Brent came of age in the middle of the 20th century, the American century. American involvement in the world and U.S. leadership, as a result, came naturally to him. It was not just that he was comfortable with both American involvement and leadership, but he was distinctly uncomfortable with the notion that involvement in leadership would ever be absent. Let me just add one thing, though, to that, what I just said, that for all those points, you would never find him talking about American exceptionalism or this country being the indispensable power. That was not his style. Brent was too quiet and modest for such boasting. He preferred that leadership be demonstrated in a manner it would be more likely to be accepted, or better yet, welcomed by others. He was a true conservative. As he said about himself, and I quote here, "I had a reputation for being cautious, a charge to which I plead guilty. I believe that one should try to change the direction of the great ship of state only with care, because changes, once made, are inordinately hard to reverse." And here and elsewhere, when I quote Brent, it's from the joint memoir he did with President Bush 41, A World Transformed. Full disclosure, I helped them with it, so now we've got the disclosures out of the way. I now work for a financial firm, and you have to make disclosures all the time. He was thus slow, this conservatism, referring to that. Brent was slow to jump on what you might call the Gorbachev bandwagon in 1989. And again, I quote, "I was suspicious of Gorbachev's motives and skeptical of his prospects." And when you dug deeper, what Brent explained what is he thought Gorbachev viewed reform, economic and political reform, as a means to an end, not as an end, but as a means to an end, with the end being the revitalization of the Soviet Union, so then it could better compete with the West. And he was slow too, Brent will admit this, to embracing German unification. He was worried at the time about its potential to destabilize Europe and the Soviet Union. And as often with the case with conservatives, he was more focused at times on avoiding what he saw as potential downsides than on reaching for the best possible future. And I think that's an important point, because often in foreign policy, we need to focus on what it is we seek to avoid rather than simply on what it is we seek to achieve if everything turns out right. None of this, by the way, let me add, is to say that Brent was inflexible. He came around on Gorbachev and to accepting there was no going back. He later wrote that, a month before the Berlin Wall came down, he was coming to the conclusion that the situation had passed the point of no return. Discontent had spread so widely that repression had ceased to be an option for the regime. Similarly, when it later became clear that German unification would and indeed needed to happen, he switched from emphasizing caution to conditions, highlighting the importance that a unified Germany remain within NATO. What came to my mind when I read all this and thought about it was the famous line of John Maynard Keynes, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?" Brent was loyal to the core, the resultant part of his military background. He was certainly loyal to the man for whom, not this campus, but this teaching center is named, George H.W. Bush. Months after the harsh repression by Chinese authorities of the protests in Tiananmen Square, he and the Deputy Secretary of State, his close friend and colleague Larry Eagleburger, were sent by the president to signal Chinese leaders that, despite our differences over the harsh handling of the protests, the United States was not interested in abandoning this relationship. What no one had anticipated, though, certainly not Brent nor Larry, was that the toast between them and the Chinese authorities was one that was to take place with the cameras rolling. As Brent later described it, "I could go through with the ceremony and be seen as toasting those the press was labeling, quote, the butchers of Tiananmen Square, or refuse the toast and put in jeopardy the whole purpose of the trip." Well, he took one for the team. This decision to go ahead with the toast was made easier by the fact that Scowcroft was a strong believer in the importance of the U.S. relationship with China, a position that, as best as I can tell, can be traced back to his time with Henry Kissinger in both the Nixon and Ford administrations. Brent was thus on the same page as his boss, as 41, in the decision to reach out to China in the wake of Tiananmen Square, and more broadly, and this was really central to Brent's foreign policy philosophy, he was a card-carrying realist. I think someone wrote a book about with that name in it. He was a card-carrying realist who believed the principal purpose of American foreign policy should be to influence the foreign policies of others rather than attempt the task of transforming their internal working or nature or structure. In the case of China in particular, he thought any attempt to place political reform at the top of U.S. priorities in the bilateral relationship would surely fail. China could and would resist American pressures to alter its system in meaningful ways. And in the process, the United States would forfeit the opportunity to develop a more cooperative and productive relationship with China in other areas. Brent was always rigorous. When it came to arms control, he was an analyst, not an idealist. He wrote once that the primary objective of arms control should be stability, not reductions for their own sake. He was no fan of the open skies proposals, suspicious of anything that smacked to him of gimmickry. More fundamentally, he believed nuclear weapons played a central and constructive role in keeping the Cold War cold and in discouraging direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union over 4 decades. He was thus no fan of calls for abolition or radical reductions in nuclear arsenals. In this and other matters, I would describe him as consistently careful. He was skeptical, just to name one thing, of great power summits that were not meticulously prepared. The wariness extended even further when it involved the possibility of the United States getting involved in what might be euphemistically described as thorny political military situations. Brent was fully on board making the case to the president, to 41, that the United States should not march on Baghdad in late February and early March of 1991 in the wake of decisive military victory on the battlefield. I know that because I was with him in the room when we did it. And I would simply say that argument, that judgment on his part, holds up pretty well with the passage of time. More generally, he tended to oppose wars of choice, be they in the complex Balkans, which he understood from having served there as a young officer, or in what became the ill-fated 2003 Iraq War. I also want to say something tonight about Brent the manager, because his impact on the national security process was and remains profound. He was a firm believer in process, that it protected presidents and administrations from themselves. In addition, and from his experience in the Ford administration, he understood that the president's presence and voice could inhibit others from saying what they believed, something that led him, when he returned to the post under 41, to create the Principals Committee without the president and vice president in the room. He also thought it essential to protect the most precious of commodities, the president's time. So Brent sought an NSC that avoided the two extremes of either substituting for the departments on one hand and letting them do their own thing without coordination or follow-up on the other. But more than anything else, he thought the National Security Advisor and the staff should avoid the temptation to become operational. This obviously was a principal takeaway from his time as a member of the Tower Commission that was empowered to look into the Iran-Contra debacle. That said, Brent understood that the National Security Advisor was required to wear not one but two hats, one of counselor, the second as manager. But it was essential in his mind, and I think this is in some ways the most basic thing to be said about his tenure as National Security Advisor, the only person who served two presidents in that role, that the former, that the counselor role, the counselor hat, not interfere with, much less take precedence over the manager. And he was scrupulous about that commitment. And Brent, as a result, gets lots of praise for being an effective manager and honest broker. But he was also prepared to put on his counselor hat when the situation warranted, and I'll give you two. He was, in his own words, appalled at the undertone of the initial National Security Council discussion that took place just after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which to him, this discussion suggested a resignation to the invasion and even adaptation to a fait accompli. He raised his concerns with the president later that morning, asking that he, Brent, be allowed not just to speak at the next NSC meeting, but to kick it off. The president agreed that he, the president, would hold back, allowed Brent to speak, and Brent did just that with great effect. And he was similarly prepared to speak up a few months later, after sitting through one of the early briefings on military plans to liberate Kuwait, a briefing prepared by Central Command. In Brent's words, quote, "It sounded unenthusiastic, delivered by people who didn't want to do the job." So he picked up the phone, made his case to the Secretary of Defense, a gentleman named Dick Cheney, who agreed and instructed the planners to go back to the drawing board and come up with plans they believed in. They did just that, and as the saying goes, the rest is history. Brent was also willing to speak out and challenge orthodoxy, and Brent's willingness to speak out and challenge orthodoxy didn't come to an end with his leaving government. Long before the 2003 war became history, became policy, he argued against it in private and in public. And more than a decade later, he had good things to say about the controversial 2015 U.S.-Iran nuclear deal. He showed a voice could be quiet, but still forceful, which strikes me as a good place to conclude my remarks. Brent Scowcroft's career provides a good lens to which to view and understand the Cold War and post-Cold War eras of American foreign policy. And his writings and actions offer up a useful lens for assessing what you might call the post-Cold War American foreign policy. We are fortunate to have had him for as long as we did, and we're worse off for not having his counsel today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. It's a privilege to introduce Dr. Jane Hall Lute, a leader in both the public and private sectors with a distinguished career in national security, cybersecurity, and international peacekeeping. From her tenure as Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to her leadership in global cybersecurity efforts, Dr. Lute has shaped policies that impact security worldwide. We are eager to learn from her extensive experience in both governance and corporate strategy. I just want to tell one story that Jane and I served together on General Scowcroft's staff during the Gulf War, and I remember you arriving. You were teaching at West Point at the time, weren't you? And we were in the plans, and I don't want to go through the stories, the fights we had, not with each other, but with other people in the office. But that was a number of years ago. Jane, please.
Well, thanks, Andy. It's Karen and Megan. It's really such a privilege to be here. You know, Brent had, you know, what was his North Star that was made such an impression on me as a young officer. He actually had several. I think you're going to hear a number of themes common among those of us who are speaking about him tonight. Karen mentioned I got 2 out of your 3. For me, they were integrity. It was humility, and it was service. And you can't have a conversation about Brent Scowcroft without keeping those things in mind. I've just got off a plane a couple hours ago from New Delhi. So if I lose track of myself in the middle of this, just throw something at me. And it was a remarkable international conversation, and it was all about, you know, Quo Vadis, U.S., what's happening, where are you going? I should tell you a little bit about my background and what brought me into Brent's orbit. I was an Army officer at the time. I went to the NSC staff after the Gulf War. I was really no stranger to Brent Scowcroft, although when Condi Rice, who was on my dissertation committee, came into my office, by the way, an office that I shared with Bob McElroy, who it turns out now is the cardinal here in Washington, D.C., a really extraordinary intellect. Anyway, Condi came in, and she said, I just got a call from Brent. Now, if you know Condi, my next question to her would not seem so unusual. I said, Musburger? And she said, no, you're a complete idiot. No, Brent Scowcroft. and he's invited me to go to the NSC staff. What do you think? I said, I don't have to think about it. You should absolutely do it. When I was at Stanford, I had written my dissertation on how wars end. Why do they end when they do? Why don't they end sooner? How do factors combine to keep wars from ending? So while you were on one end of the conversation, Andrew and I were sitting at the other end of the conversation, and I remember walking into that office in the J5 of the CENTCOM staff and looking at this lieutenant colonel who was saying, I am going to call Jim Baker right now and get this cleared up. I thought, whoa. This is an altogether different league. But I learned a lot then and over the course of my career. When I got to the NSC staff, I was actually the last director for European and Soviet affairs. They didn't make those anymore after that. They had broken us up into the former Soviet Union and Europe. But I learned many, many lessons that I still carry with me today. One of the first things that when I met Brent, went into his office, he and Bob Gates were in there. And he said, look, I have a few rules here. You know, when you write memorandum to the president, that's where it goes. So be right. He placed a very, very high premium on the intellectual foundations of whatever arguments or positions that we were putting forward. And as Richard mentioned, Brent's career spanned, you know, kept from the middle of the 20th century to well into this one, the 4 strategic eras, the 4 great strategic eras of my professional lifetime, all of our professional lifetime, I think. And each of those eras was characterized by a singular question. Right after World War II, the era that began, the strategic central question was, how do we prevent World War III? It was the dominant question of those decades. And then after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the rise of the superpower confrontation in earnest, with the implication, as Richard mentioned, of nuclear weapons, which Brent thought was core to understanding and managing the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, that question during the 60s and 70s was, how do we prevent nuclear annihilation? How do we preserve a stability and allow us to prevent crises from turning into the potential for the use of nuclear weapons? The third era began with the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and where it was very clear that the United States was that much more powerful than anyone else. The end of the Cold War, the beginning of the post-Cold War era. That was the Bush 41 administration. And this period was really characterized by one question: what will the United States do with its power? And more recently, I would say over the past 20 years, with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, it's hard to overstate how shocking that was to countries and governments around the world. But the central question has become, or has been, how fragile is the American commitment to liberal democratic values? It's a question that the world is still wrestling with today, although I think we're entering into a new era, as we know. Brent's career spanned all of this time. Even after government, he continued to be engaged. And it was overwhelmingly clear that Brent's priority was to take action that was in the best interest of our country, mindful of the president's priorities. What were those interests? What are the interests of this country? The ones we talk about now, we didn't talk about them in the same way now 30 years ago or more. But those interests are: we need a safe and secure place to live. We need a dynamic economic engine that can generate new wealth. We need strong friends and allies, and we need predictable relations with others. That's largely about the international rule of law, based on the liberal order that the United States helped create, indeed drove, in the aftermath of World War II. And Brent and President Bush worked so hard during their tenure in this very critical period to preserve and to advance. Brent, as Richard also mentioned, he brought many strengths to the task that he had. It brought a lot of experience, certainly, but he knew how to think, he knew how to act, and yes, he absolutely knew how to lead. He had a deep commitment to rigorous thinking. What's happening in the world? Where's it going? What's in the best interests of the United States? How do we get this government to act effectively for those interests? He also had a very deep understanding how to get options out of a clunky bureaucracy and how to get decisions out of a busy, preoccupied, overwhelmed at times president, as they all are at times. And the Bush era, I think it second to none in the challenges that it was facing, one after the other: the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union collapsing. These are not in order, as my husband pointed out to me. The unification of Germany, the Tiananmen Square, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, the war in Yugoslavia, a devastating crisis unfolding in Somalia, and there were others. There were also things happening domestically: a massive earthquake in San Francisco, the Exxon Valdez, and an economy that seemed to be sputtering at times. But Brent ran a tight ship. If you sent a memo to the president and you typed in the little macro that said, memorandum for the president, that's where it went. And he insisted that you be right. And also I remember saying, he said, look, when you go down to the Oval Office, you go right down from my office, you turn left, and you don't stop anywhere along the way. And then you come right back here when you're done. He had enormous freedom of access and influence with the president, but he was also extremely collegial. But he really didn't brook a lot of interference with the running of the NSC staff from any other official, even the vice president. And when you are asked a question by the president, do not say, well, Mr. President, that's your decision. He knows that. Okay, he knows that. So, you're supposed to be equipped with the information he needs after carefully preparing it and representing the interests of the rest of the bureaucracy, or the positions, I should say, of the rest of the bureaucracy. But as Richard pointed out, he also would take the opportunity to offer his own reflections, even when he disagreed with the president. And through it all, he never wavered. He knew his president. He had built a process. Yes, out of the Tower Commission, he knew a lot of things that had gone wrong with Iran-Contra and other things. And he also had known what better can look like from his own experience twice as being National Security Advisor to presidents. So he knew his president, certainly Bush 41, they were very close. And that was a real advantage, not only for the NSC staff and the process that Brent had built, but also for the country, because that meant there was a high-fidelity channel of communication between the president and his most senior foreign policy advisor. He knew his president, he built the process, and he trusted his people. Well, who were those people? There's some of us in this room. There was more than 100 that served on the NSC staff over the course of the 4 years. I think there's 100 now in a single office at the NSC staff. It has grown like Topsy. But Brent kept it small and lean, and you work 6.5 days a week continually. I mean, as I said, all these crises that were unfolding. But these 100 people had remarkable careers. Richard is a good example. There are other people here. Some became cabinet secretaries, some sub-cabinet, many ambassadors, leaders in industry and academia, and if counted up, over 3,000 years of public service represented in that group. One of the legacies of the Bush 41 presidency and of the Scowcroft NSC staff was this enormous legacy of public service. Quite a legacy in addition to his other achievements. What will I remember most about my time with Brent, and we stayed close over the years? He was the one who urged me to go to the United Nations, a decision I never regretted. He didn't have any false hopes or false ideals, as Richard said. He was a realist. But he said this organization needs to succeed. It was designed to have assertive U.S. leadership, like NATO was designed to have assertive U.S. leadership. But what will I remember most about him? Was it his intellect, his intellectual rigor? Was it his skillful leadership? Was it his humor? I'm a kid from New Jersey. It took me a little while to adjust to Utah humor, but he had a wicked sense of humor. Was it his courage? Was it his convictions? Was it his selfless service? Yeah, surely it was all of these things. But most of all, I remember his kindness. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jane. We are delighted to welcome Professor Bat Sparrow, a renowned scholar whose work focuses on the intersection of American governance and the international system. With his expertise in international and national security and U.S. foreign policy, particularly through his brilliant biography of Brent Scowcroft, Professor Sparrow brings a wealth of knowledge to today's discussion. He comes from another university in Texas, which is the word we will not speak. Some of you don't know the rivalry in Texas. He comes from UT, okay, University of Texas. But we will forgive you, Bat, today for that. Anyway, we look forward to your comments. But he did the definitive biography of Brent. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Ambassador Natsios, the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs, Dean John Sherman, and the Bush School of Government and Public Service, Cassandra, Monica, and the staff at the Scowcroft Institute and the Bush School for hosting this event. It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to speak to you about Brent Scowcroft and his legacy. I'd like to share a backstory to the biography, and this year marks its 10th anniversary. I assure you it is on point. When I started my research, the general already had plans underway to write his autobiography. So in my mind, a double-edged sword of Damocles hung over my head. what I wrote would be proven incorrect and be overshadowed by the general's memoirs. After all, I was an outsider, unaffiliated with the military, diplomatic corps, policy world, Washington press corps, or industry, so I feared that the biography would be quickly discounted. Or the biography would be published after his autobiography and therefore would attract little interest. Whatever the reason, the general decided not to proceed, and I bring this up because I was consequently the twofold beneficiary of his generosity. First, he agreed to be interviewed once a month for over a 4-year period, and second, he willingly gave his support for the project, such that members of his family, his colleagues, his associates, his acquaintances would all consent to be interviewed. For these wonderful two gifts of time and trust, I am and was tremendously grateful. What I'd like to do today is say something of General Scowcroft's legacy as a policymaker in light of his superlative example he set as a public servant, and so to illuminate capacities that we can strive to nurture. These are qualities I've come to appreciate not only from my studies of the Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and 2 Bush administrations, but also from my separate work on McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Truman White Houses. A caveat: an examination of presidential decision-making has at least 2 parts. One is the study of the president's own personal proclivities, his policy priorities, and his decision-making processes, which you've heard about. What motivates him? How does he structure the flow of information and input? Does he work better verbally or in writing? Does he make his own decisions, hash them out with 1 or 2 advisors, or open them up to discussions with multiple stakeholders? The other part, which derives from the president's administrative style, are then the roles that his advisors and principals appointees play, and accordingly how their decision-making priorities and processes affect the government. To some extent, this is baked in, depending on who the president selects as his top advisors and cabinet secretaries. But it's also true that presidents have limited knowledge of how their appointees will perform once they are in office. And it's in this latter respect that I'll be talking about Scowcroft's qualities as a decision maker, as someone who's very much empowered by President George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, 41. One of General Scowcroft's remarkable qualities, and my judgment hasn't changed over the last 10 years, was his ability to communicate with, reach out to, and not infrequently persuade different audiences. He had multiple fields of expertise, and I mean expertise, more than passing knowledge or minimal competence. He was fluent in several languages, as it were. So let me spell these out. One was military affairs and particularly strategic forces. His first assignment out of flight school was flying a P-51D as a wingman for the Strategic Air Command. He later studied at the National War College, then led by General Andrew Goodpaster. He worked at the Pentagon under General Yudkin, who helped develop the Single Integrated Operation Plan, SIOP. During the Reagan administration, he chaired the President's Commission on Strategic Forces, the eponymous Scowcroft Commission. And during the Bush administration, he negotiated the reduction of nuclear weapons with the USSR and the conversion of merged warhead missiles to single warhead missiles, culminating in START 1. This expertise was evident in his extensive participation in military affairs, culminating with the collapse of the Soviet Union, as well as in articles, books, reports, op-ed pieces, and so forth. The second domain was U.S. foreign policy and international relations. Scowcroft studied international relations under William T.R. Fox at Columbia. It was Fox who coined the term superpower. He worked with Henry Kissinger, of course, was twice U.S. National Security Advisor, and again wrote articles, reports, op-ed pieces, and books. Books he co-authored with George Bush, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and David Ignatius. Hence his credibility with foreign policy experts, journalists, academics, and politicians on issues of national security, U.S. foreign policy, and international affairs. No surprise, then, at how much his NATO counterparts, foreign heads of state and their advisors, members of Congress, colleagues at the Aspen Strategy Group and the Atlantic Council, and his clients at the Scowcroft Group trusted him. A third sphere of Scowcroft's expertise was intelligence. He began training on intelligence early in his career, served in the Yugoslav embassy as Air Force attaché, and worked on top secret issues in the Pentagon before going to the White House as military assistant to the president, where he was responsible for managing transportation, handling communications, medical care, facilities, and anything else White House related. Scowcroft was cool and observant, his supervising officer in Belgrade wrote. He had great perception of the intelligence collection targets and displayed ingenuity, skill, and tenacity in devising methods of collecting intelligence under the most adverse circumstances. Scowcroft subsequently played a large role in handling the 1974 scandal in the CIA, which prompted a reorganization of foreign intelligence and covert actions centered on the National Security Advisor and the NSC staff. The intelligence reorganization further resulted in the establishment of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, the Intelligence Oversight Board, and the Operations Advisory Group, and led to the passage of new laws for the protection of intelligence sources and methods. In short, Scowcroft was highly knowledgeable of the substance and processes of intelligence, and he was obviously very close to Bush, a former CIA director, and Robert Gates, who spent his career at the agency before becoming Scowcroft's deputy, and then in 1991 becoming DCI himself. A fourth domain was business. Scowcroft and Sons had been a large dry goods wholesaler in the Intermountain West, and he thought that after his time in the military, he'd go back to the family business. Between the Ford and Bush administrations, he worked with Kissinger Associates and with 5 others started his own international business consulting firm, and in 1995 formed the highly respected and influential Scowcroft Group. He was also a member of several corporate and nonprofit boards, so he's familiar with corporate America and had great credibility among U.S. and foreign business leaders. This capacity to overlap distinct policy subsystems, reach across professions, and bridge severed organizations is highly common among U.S. officials and politicians, just as it is in academia. Furthermore, the person who can span disciplinary and institutional boundaries, can communicate with different knowledge communities, as it were, is far more likely to gain valuable perspective and see the bigger picture. Such a person is also in a position of potentially immense influence. Before I go on to his other qualities, let me step back a bit and point out that implicit in this capacity, this multivocality, as it were, are 3 more basic qualities. One is ambition, the desire to make a difference and not settle for business as usual. Scowcroft pushed himself. Another is risk tolerance. New roles mean the possibility of failure, of your advice being dismissed, and of your judgments being overruled. A third is curiosity. Being a policymaker requires the ability to function at high levels with partial and imperfect information. All the more reason, then, to ask questions, solicit points of view, and being open, being willing to learn from others, and being ready to change positions. Subordinating the ego for the greater good. So how might we, especially as graduate students or early career professionals, develop these qualities? Well, for Scowcroft, he chose a career in the Army Air Corps, and the U.S. Air Force allowed him new opportunities. But he could have worked at another branch of the armed forces, for a U.S. multinational, in intelligence, for another organization that routinely rotates its top employees and has them take on fresh responsibilities. So he was also able to become an expert in multiple fields through formal education at West Point, at Georgetown, at the Strategic Intelligence School, the Joint Forces Staff College, the National War College, as well as teaching his own classes at West Point and the U.S. Air Force Academy. He kept learning. So you can decide where to work, what classes to take, or what other degrees to pursue. Perhaps the easiest way to acquire expertise is reading broadly and in depth, attending lectures and seminars when you can, and asking questions to develop a growth mindset. The hardest thing, someone once told me, is to think for yourself, to really think. So back to Scowcroft's other qualities as a decision maker, and these are a little briefer. A second distinguishing quality was his ability to anticipate the actions of others. Here's where I believe in the importance of history, he said. History taught him about how countries behave and helped him remain objective when thinking about particular people and specific events. This sense of history allowed him to determine the features of the pieces in play, to understand their origins, to figure out how they would interact, and to calculate how events might then unfold. This historically informed knowledge of the moving parts in a situation, of their respective trajectories, and how the balance among them lay, allowed him to narrow the scope of decision making, to gauge others' perceptions and possible courses of actions. In other words, history provided a portfolio of precedents and a repertoire of actions to draw upon. An example was the Mayaguez in May 75. 2 weeks after the evacuation of Saigon, Scowcroft's reference was the 1968 Pueblo incident, when North Korean forces captured the USS Pueblo, an intelligence gathering ship, and proceeded to hold the crew captive for nearly a year before their release. The president and his advisors dreaded the possibility that the Mayaguez crew might become political hostages and the pawns of the Khmer Rouge. And if Cambodian authorities removed the members of the crew to the mainland, Lawrence Eagleburger wrote, their recovery would have been virtually impossible unless the Cambodians decided to release them, and who knows after how many months and how much agony and humiliation. So President Ford, Scowcroft, Kissinger, and others in the Ford administration ensured there would be no Pueblo. The use of a historical example can either mislead or blinder as easily as it can inform, of course, as Richard Neustadt and Ernst May have written. Still, knowing more history is unequivocally better than knowing less, and the policymaker who knows their history allows them to identify helpful or misleading parallels and accordingly to direct debate and discussion in more productive directions. With his West Point classes as a student and teacher, his MA and PhD courses at Columbia, Scowcroft took what I count to be about 20 history classes, because some were in government and public law, almost half on European history, but also courses on Latin American, Middle Eastern, and Far Eastern history. It is impossible to imagine that this background was not extremely useful when he was in the Pentagon and coordinating U.S. military relations with Latin American air forces, when he was working with European allies in the USSR during German reunification and over the waning months of the Cold War, and in the fall of 1991 when he was preparing the United States leadership of a 42-state coalition for the forcible eviction of the Iraqi military from Kuwait. With a change of undergraduate and graduate curricula and the degree requirements since the 40s and 50s, it's hard to imagine anyone except for a PhD student in history taking so many history classes. But as I previously pointed out, it's very possible to take and audit classes, of course, and to read. I want to bring up two other qualities of Scowcroft's decision-making, similar to spanning boundaries, and his knowledge of history are foundational. And by foundational, I mean that they form the substrate or basis for decision-making. So they do not concern the content itself or how the meetings are conducted or who is invited to attend the meetings, important topics in their own right, to be sure, as you've heard. Rather, they prepare the ground for productive deliberation. The first of these, and the third overall quality I'll mention, is gardening, a concept introduced into the diplomatic vernacular by George Shultz. To garden is to listen, nurture, cultivate ties with the principles of other countries, heads of state, foreign ambassadors of the United States, and others. It is to maintain contact with your counterparts even after conflicts or problems arise, and to wait patiently for opportune moments for improving relations, and to wait. It is to keep lines open, to keep investing and reinvesting in a relationship, watering, fertilizing, and weeding if need be. So to garden is to know that new issues will spring up, that new objectives will arise, and such there will be continuing need for allies and coalition partners. General Scowcroft, President Bush, and James Baker believed in gardening. They kept their ties open to other countries, even during periods of serious disagreement, rivalry, and controversy. Even when there was no obvious agenda on how to proceed, even when there was no apparent prospect of improved relations. There's probably no better example of this than Bush and Scowcroft's hands-on relationship with China throughout the tumultuous years from '89 through '92, which consisted of careful attention to dialogue, diplomacy, and cultivating relationships when a clear agenda was not apparent and when there seemed to be little potential for productive results. This gardening, this listening and attending until the time was ripe, paid off in two chief respects. Scowcroft pointed out China refrained from challenging the United States at crucial moments. It abstained from voting against the UN Security Council resolution for the removal of our Iraqi forces from Kuwait. and it muted its reaction to the sale of F-16s to Taiwan in 1992. China remembered the terrible savaging Bush took for them, the U.S. ambassador to China remarked, and when it came to the time to collect the fee for that, he could do it. The other payoff was that the Chinese party leaders eventually agreed to many of the administration's objectives. They went ahead with the commercial and military deals postponed by Tiananmen Square. They released the dissident Fang Lichu, and they subsequently opened the Chinese economy to the world, encouraging trade and foreign investment, establishing capital markets within China, joining the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which became the WTO in 1995. Gardening receives far less attention than fighting wars, countering terrorism, or even providing relief to disaster victims, natural or man-made, but is an indispensable, if unheralded, part of international relations. I think Scowcroft's knowledge of history helped him see things from others' points of view to an extent, and thus why gardening was necessary. And so the premise of gardening is that people and events are nuanced, complicated, and sometimes contradictory. So at a time when politicians, polls, and the press put things in oversimple and in preset categories, it prioritized maintaining ties, even with our adversaries, knowing that things are rarely black and white. Lastly, Scowcroft knew who he was. He was poised and self-assured, willing to stand up to President Nixon's fearsome, domineering Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, when he was military assistant. He was ready to challenge a bullying Henry Kissinger when he was his deputy, and he was willing to speak truth to power, as we know from his protest in 2002 against the Bush administration's plans to invade Iraq and depose President Saddam Hussein, to speak the truth to power for the sake of protecting American blood and treasure. So how do we do this? How do we have this poise and dedication amidst the immensely powerful institutional, political, economic, and cultural forces that bear down on us? I don't pretend to have an answer to this, but I have a few thoughts. It calls for introspection amid the volatility and precarity of the present. It calls for an ethics of our lives, religious or otherwise. It calls for reflecting on who we want to be and how we want to live our lives. It might call for confronting our mortality. And here's where I think Scowcroft's near-death airplane crash and his 2 years in Army hospitals had a crystallizing effect. And it calls for thinking about our legacies. This very celebration speaks to Scowcroft's presence and purpose. There will be more such celebrations. Thank you.
And our final speaker is none other than the scholar and State House historian, James Graham Wilson, who is an expert in diplomatic history, whose work examines the critical moments of U.S. foreign policy, particularly during the Cold War. He is the author of several significant books: America's Cold Warrior, The Triumph of Improvisation. Dr. Wilson has contributed invaluable insights into the history of national security. We are excited to hear from him about the shaping of U.S. diplomacy and the Cold War's legacy. James.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you for having me here. I'm obliged to say the views expressed here are those of my own and not the U.S. government or the U.S. State Department. I'm obliged to say that. I wanted to say, first off, you know, how gracious I feel to the Bush School and to you, Andrew, because some 10 or 11 years ago, you had me down to Texas, and I had the pleasure of meeting with Brent Scowcroft, and I get to working on his papers, reading his papers every day, and his personality comes through, and it was exactly the same as him in person, and I agree wholeheartedly with what Karen said, that he's a figure to be lauded, studied, and researched. And for all of you, there are several former Deputy National Security Advisors in the room. There are several potential future ones. I think a takeaway is just he comes across to me as a kind and humble man who treated people with decency and loyalty and respect. Now, I brought one document that has been declassified. It's been an exciting week for declassification of government documents, but I think this really speaks to me. In May of 1989, there's one paragraph through which Brent Scowcroft wrote President Bush for an upcoming NSC meeting. And he writes, "Mr. President, this is a distressingly formidable package and casts only minimal light on a very important and difficult subject. I suggest you spend minimal time looking at the package and that you consider the meeting tomorrow primarily a listening session for yourself." This may seem an unusual way to address the President of the United States, yet I think it was typical for Scowcroft and the relationship he had with President Bush. And I think it encapsulates him as a strategist and practitioner of national security. And I'll say 2 points that I think it underscores, and Ambassador Haas and Dr. Lute have touched on several of the themes here. The first is that what it says about the historical moment of May 22nd, 1989. The subject for the next day was a meeting to go over the defense strategy review that President Bush had commissioned shortly after taking office on January 20th, 1989. Now, as some of you may recall, the Bush administration came into office following President Ronald Reagan's dramatic encounters with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who himself had just given a blockbuster speech at the United Nations in December of 1988, in which he pledged to massive reductions in Soviet and Warsaw Pact conventional forces. By May of 1989, there was tremendous pressure on the Bush administration to do something. And this period became memorialized later in a book by Strobe Talbot and Michael Beschloss as The Pause. And Scowcroft was continuing to say in May of 1989, let's be cautious. Why caution? Well, we've heard of his caution, but why should we be cautious? Now, in the package that Scowcroft sent President Bush, there's a paragraph, and I quote, "There have been historically risks inherent in the conventional imbalance in Europe, risks that we have accepted by maintaining the threat of potential nuclear escalation. If the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact reduce their forces and NATO maintains its current capabilities, we may have a new opportunity to narrow the gap between our strategy and the capabilities on which it rests. However, since redressing the balance would require resources, it will mean fewer resources will be available for other defense and non-defense needs. This issue has large implications for future resource allocations, alliance management, and our negotiating positions on conventional arms control." Now, looking back on all of this from 2025, we know how history played out that year. We know that the fall of 1989 turned out to be miraculous, in that Soviet power in Eastern Europe collapsed broadly peacefully. Yet it's important to put yourself in the shoes of Brent Scowcroft or Richard Haas or Jane Hull at this historical moment. Now, and neither of them wrote this memo, by the way, and it wasn't Noah's dad. But, you know, in the papers, it's a sort of long-winded way of saying it's unclear what Gorbachev will do and what the second and third order consequences will be on U.S. alliances and security challenges. Now, keep in mind as well that May 22nd comes during the protests in Tiananmen Square that have not yet turned violent but are about to turn violent. And I think Scowcroft is saying there's a lot to consider. There's a lot more we need to consider. And in the meantime, we need to see how things play out. In his very illuminating Miller Center oral history, which was released in August of 2020, I encourage everyone to read, Scowcroft reflects on some of his deep concerns over Reagan's policies toward Gorbachev and the proclamations in 1988, even on the part of UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, that the Cold War was over. Gorbachev was seductive, I think Scowcroft believed. And the spring of 1989 reminded him of his own first tenure in the White House during the détente era of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. Scowcroft, as we've heard, was military assistant to the National Security Advisor, Deputy National Security Advisor, and then National Security Advisor, when there had also been talk of the Cold Wars being over. Détente had collapsed gradually with the continued Soviet nuclear buildup and communist penetration of the so-called Third World, and then suddenly, in December of 1979, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And from Gorbachev's perspective, from Scowcroft's perspective, Gorbachev was an important and humane Soviet leader who, as he says, was not actually interested in changing the Soviet Union. That is to say, the Soviet system, that is to say, this is Scowcroft reflecting 10 years later on his own thinking in 1989. And by the time Bush took office in January of 1989, nothing about the Cold War had actually changed. Moreover, as he revealed again in this oral history, far more so than he expressed publicly at the time, I think, Scowcroft had been extremely skeptical of the 1987 INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which President Reagan and his Secretary of State, George Shultz, considered to be a crowning achievement, and that it was the first agreement ever to eliminate an entire category of nuclear weapons. And as Ambassador Haas has said, this was a very complex issue, and Scowcroft was not at all naive or taken by idealism. Scowcroft actually thought it left NATO in worse shape because it left Germany isolated. The remaining short-range missiles consisted only of ones in West or East Germany that could reach each other, and all this created all sorts of complications. So to sum up, when it comes to the Bush administration's defense strategy review and strategic planning more broadly, Scowcroft urged caution. He said in his oral history that arms control was his top priority. However, by this moment, the spring of 1989, more important than arms control was to shore up U.S. alliances and to allow political processes to play out in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Now, my second point is what I think this says about the Scowcroft model. I'd venture to guess to say that every national security advisor since 1992 has cited it in some way as an aspirational thing. And Stephen Hadley, who would then become the national security advisor and had worked for Scowcroft in the Ford administration, has spelled this out in a wonderful Scowcroft paper published in 2017. So what did it mean in May of 1989? I think it's important to say here that Scowcroft did not come into the White House in January of 1989 and revolutionize how the National Security Council was structured. As some may recall, and it's been mentioned, the great crucible for the NSC came with the revelations of the Iran-Contra scandal in 1986, and the charge that then National Security Advisor John Poindexter had encouraged a so-called operational NSC that would usurp some of the traditional functions of independent agencies. Now, the 1987 Tower Commission identified some structural problems and made some specific solutions. Scowcroft was probably the lead figure in this work and was assisted by Steve Hadley and Nick Rostow. However, many of their recommendations were actually implemented quite quickly by the new National Security Advisor, Frank Carlucci, and his then deputy National Security Advisor, Colin Powell, who succeeded Carlucci in 1988 and was the immediate predecessor to Brent Scowcroft. I've also had the great pleasure of hearing Colin Powell complain that it should be called the Scowcroft model, the Powell model, and he would I think talk to my colleagues and me for about an hour about this, that he himself had done this, but they had a very wonderful relationship so far as I could tell. But I think there's two essential points here within the second point about the meeting of the Scowcroft model. And it may sound like a trivial thing, but I think it turned out to be very important, and that is this setting up of the so-called Principals Committee. So after Carlucci and Powell came on board in 87 and 88, George Shultz, who by that point was the longest serving cabinet secretary in the Reagan administration, he said in uncertain terms that I can imagine his voice saying that he would not attend a meeting at the White House that neither the president nor he himself chaired. And in fact, I think a little known and interesting, we're all sort of junkies here of NSC history or this period, right? But to me, it's quite interesting. In 1988, Secretary of State George Shultz actually chairs a series of meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff without the president and with the National Security Advisor sitting there as a subordinate. But in January of 1989, Scowcroft very quickly got the incoming Secretary of State, Jim Baker, to allow him to chair these Principals Committee meetings at which the president was absent. And I've actually found in working on the Foreign Relations series, not a lot of these meetings from 89 to 92, partly because George Bush was so interested in foreign policy. But I think that moment really had a long-term consequence in sort of how the National Security Council was run. And I'm pretty sure that no subsequent National Security Advisor ever thought about relenting this ability to call these meetings. And so how does it relate to this paragraph here? Well, I think what Scowcroft is saying to the president is that you should be in listening mode at this formal NSC meeting. And Scowcroft probably was also in listening mode. But the thing is that everyone in this room that's going to this meeting knows that Scowcroft himself can call a meeting to follow up and can say quietly, well, the president and I discussed this meeting the other day, and this is where I think we should go. And so it's a very subtle thing, but I think, if you go the line from 1989 to 2025, I think it's a sort of an important moment. Now, most importantly, I mean, the Scowcroft model, it's not just something on paper. I mean, the close relationship that I've seen in these documents, really between Scowcroft and Bush, was special and important. And there's two moments that really stuck out to me when I was rereading this oral history the other day. And the first is, during the October 1986 Reykjavik summit, I'll forgive you because I need to forgive myself that I really hadn't thought a lot about where George Bush was when Reagan is with Gorbachev at Reykjavik. And I was reminded, if I had ever known before, that Bush is actually sitting with Brent Scowcroft watching television, watching all of this play out on the TV. And especially, there's a moment where Secretary of State George Shultz tears up in frustration about how close Reagan and Gorbachev got, and to a blockbuster deal to eliminate all nuclear weapons. And as Scowcroft describes it to Ernest May and Phil Zelikow, that he actually, it was a great relief to him that SDI had stood in the way of an agreement, even though he himself was quite skeptical of SDI as a concept. And the important thing, I think, to me is that Scowcroft and Bush then argued about this, quite vociferously during this moment. And George Bush, who was a self-admittedly sentimental guy, he sort of felt the pain that both sides had come so tantalizingly close and that it hadn't worked out. And this is where I think it really encapsulates this sense of Bush and Scowcroft as alter egos, that there was a kind of, the other side, they could, I don't know, have these types of conversations, these types of arguments, and rely on each other's judgment as a sounding board. And so I'll just close on the second example about this, which I think really, again, speaks to their relationship. When he's asked about the origins of the term New World Order, Scowcroft described fly fishing with the president in 1990. And they're talking through the meaning of the end of the Cold War, the potential end of the Cold War, and what the world would look like next. And here's the thing that jumped off the page to me, right? They spent 4 hours with each other in utter seclusion, in a bucolic and offline setting, talking only to each other about what they could do together to make the world a better place. And I think it's a wonderful example to think about as we go forward and try to apply the wonderful legacy of Brent Scowcroft to the world today.
Thank you very much. So we have dessert. Monica, where's Monica? Here. We have dessert. Do we bring it back in here and then go for Q&A? Out there. So we have them. We'll have them toward the window, and everybody else can. Or do you just want to do it informally? It's up to me. Oh, it's a good way. Okay, so I asked the 4 speakers to have their back to the windows with a dessert, of course. And if you want to ask questions, I'll ask everybody after they eat a little bit to be silent, and then we'll call on people and they can ask questions. But you'll be standing up. Okay? Thank you very much.